Yeah, just tell me where did I end up? Because at one stage I was talking, I was like, wait, things are way too quiet. And then I was like, hello? Hello? So I don't know where I got up to.
Okay, okay, we're gonna have to go to the slide and I'll point out exactly where.
All right.
The last thing I wrote was, yeah, the law not being applied to animals. We were by the present and future generations, and you're talking about how it's broken into sections, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I think let me just backtrack. So section 24 has two sections. Did you get that? It's got a negative right and a positive right.
Yeah, we got that. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So I had discussed the positive, I mean the negative right, which is living in an environment that's not harmful to one's health or well-being. And did you understand that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I
All right.
got
So what I'll do is I'll just start from the second part of the right.
yeah.
Even if I'm double talking or repeating something, it's okay. I just think just to make it clean like that.
Okay.
Okay. So section 24 is the progressive right, part of the environmental right. So what do we mean by progressive realization? Or it also can be called a positive right. It means that government has to take certain actions to progress that right moving forward. So, for example, your right to dignity, that's a negative right. So, you know, if somebody hurts your dignity in one way or the other, that is instantly government has to take action to protect your dignity. But if it's a progressive realization right or a positive right, like, say, an access to housing or access to water and food, that's a progressive realization, which means that government can take policies and it doesn't have to be instantly provided for. It can take number of years, which kind of makes sense because you can't just build a house in a day. But government is also lagged behind because this philosophy of what we define a progressive realization of that right. Now, when we come to the environment, when we talk about section 24B, that's what is in brackets called the progressive realization section of the right. But sometimes it has some negative connotations to it just because an environmental right is more nuanced than a socioeconomic right or civil and political right.
Yeah.
Because it's a new aged right, it's a third generation right, and people are still struggling to find out exactly where it's molded. But for all intents and purposes, it can be defined as a positive or progressive realization right.
Okay.
Now, in terms of what we mean by progressive realization, so that means government has to take steps. So, and that's exactly what Section 24B says. It says that everyone has the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of future and present generations through, and this is the kicker, reasonable legislative and other measures. And then what they try and define legislative and other measures, they define them as three sections. So those reasonable legislative and other measures that prevent pollution and ecological degradation, that promote conservation, and that secure ecologically sustainable development and use of natural resources while promoting justifiable economic social development.
Okay.
And what government has tended to do is focus on the last one, on sustainable development and using natural resources to promote justifiable socio-economic reform and development. But that, as we know, has been a failure of government because although they make these excuses that the reason why we're building this shopping mall or the reason why we're doing this and that is so we can provide socioeconomic rights, which is very important. But then they couch behind as to why things cost so much, and obviously corruption has come out of it, which is a problem. So that's one of the scapegoats for government to justify their spending, and it's obviously wrong. They shouldn't be doing that. They should be justifying it for poor and marginalized people to get access to water and food and shelter and things like that. Okay, so going back to the first thing where I said to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations. So that is a principle that is very well known internationally as well in South Africa, and it's pretty much a climate change principle. Okay, what do we mean by for the benefit of future and present generations? Well, obviously we've got an environment that needs to be used in a certain way that can benefit the future and the present generation currently. And what's happened is that South Africa, or the South African government rather, has neglected to discuss the issues of future benefits. I mean, for, future beneficiaries. They've obviously focused on the present, and that's because of apartheid, and they had to ramp up development very quickly so they could provide resources to poor and marginalized people. But they've neglected the issue of what do we do in the future. And that's obviously another issue that needs to be looked at, tackled in a certain way. But that's where you start understanding the climate side around it. Because, as you know, South Africa is hell bent on using coal for energy, which is impacting our ability to have a sustainable environment, to promote an environment that's not harmful to your health or well-being. And that has had a significant impact on people's health, particularly in Mpumalanga and in Secunda and those areas there where obviously coal is being burnt every day and the coal mines and all of that. And so, but you can see that this is a very quick and short win for the South African government because it's a cheap way to create energy. But again, it's impacting the issue of for the benefit of future generations. What do those power plants do or will impact South Africa in the future? We don't know yet. We don't know how bad it's going to get. So, as you know, South Africa's national development plan has not really been designed for a climate crisis, which we're on a collision course. Um, and because of that, you know, although they're trying to promote Section 24, they're doing it in a way that is impacting the environment rather than promoting an environment that can sustain the future generation in South Africa.
Yeah.
So that's obviously quite a critical issue that needs to be looked at, and probably one of the biggest fights that I think will probably happen in the courts is around that particular clause in the Constitution. Okay. Now, in terms of other measures, so obviously the government needs to develop legislation, which you know it's clearly written, but they need to take other measures as well. And those measures typically are international diplomacy, policy at a regional level, policy at a national level, implementing those policies and plans, and making sure that they're obviously affecting and promoting Section 24. So, you know, just to give you a quick example of a policy, well, that would be the climate change presidential panel that's been commissioned. So that would be, you know, taking other measures to try and promote Section 24 of the Constitution. Another example is us being part of the Paris Agreement and sending forward our NDCs. You know, the what are they called? The levels of CO2 that we're allowed to emit. I think it's every 5 years we have to send a new standard to the IPCC, and IPCC is the international body that is linked to the Paris Agreement, that is linked to the United Nations, that are making sure governments are abiding by their own standards of how much CO2 and carbon can be emitted per country per capita. So those are policies, plans and actions that are being taken, which are defined as other measures. Another really important one is the implementation of prosecuting people for polluting crime or undertaking what is typically known as the green crimes. So green crimes, you know, the poaching of abalone, the poaching of rhinos, the cutting down of rare trees and things like that is one side. But then you got the other side of mining pollution, degradation of water resources, chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides. That's all wound up into three particular policing departments, and they're called the green scorpions, the blue scorpions, and the brown scorpions. And they are situated in various departments. So the brown scorpions are typically found in the Department of Mineral and Energy, and they typically deal with pollution crime. So if a mine pollutes a water resource, or if the air quality is bad, or they fail to rehabilitate, then the mining department tends to kick in. Not really. I mean, in reality, they don't do anything, but that's what should happen. Then the blue scorpions fall under the Department of Water and Sanitation. And the last one, the green scorpions, which are typically around green crimes, they fall under the Department of Fishery, Forestry and Environment. So that again, that's another system that's been put in place to try and promote Section 24. So that's the policing side and the prosecuting authority and all that then kicks in from that side. So government plays this due role of policy and planning and regulations, and then there's the other side of enforcement and compliance that also has to kick in, which try to promote Section 24. Then the last important thing that's linked to the Constitution are our international principles. So the Constitution has clauses in it where it says we have to abide by international laws and principles, that we have accepted them to be international laws and principles, or they form part of customary law, international customary law. So just a quick understanding of international customary law is laws that have been created through generations of actions being taken, or has been handed down by the International Court of Justice, or things like that. That's what we mean by customary laws. And then you've obviously got your treaties, which is like your Paris Agreement, or the Rome Statute when it comes to genocide and things like that South Africa are now part of and we belong to. So those two types of international law that exist, South Africa has to implement and promote them in South Africa, which obviously assists South Africa, particularly in the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol and all of that that's linked to climate change, that's linked to Section 24, promoting an environment that's not harmful to your health or well-being, and protecting the environment for the future and for the benefit of future and present generations. So again, very important. International principles do play a role. Then you get soft international principles, which have not been accepted in South African law, but government has undertaken certain policies around those soft international principles in order to make sure that we are continuously updating ourselves with international norms and standards when it comes to environmental laws. So, perfect example there would be us accepting the guidelines. It's called what are they called? I think it's called the Robben Island Guidelines for Torture of Prisoners, for example. So although they're not law, we accept those guidelines and abide by them, for example. Okay, so that is the environmental law and the Constitution. Now, I did explain to you about anthropocentric philosophy and how that's linked to sustainable development. And sustainable development is probably one of the biggest principles that are used in environmental law. And it's probably, for me, one of the biggest issues now when we're facing with this climate crisis that's coming to kick in. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, unless there's any questions now.
No, I don't have any.
Okay, great. Okay, so the next one we're going to move is now the environmental legislation. So, and particularly we're going to focus obviously in South Africa. So as you remember in Section 24 of the Constitution, it says that they had to implement reasonable legislation, okay? And this is where this act, so you've got the National Environmental Management Act that came in 1998. And that act is the framework act that has a couple of important chapters to it. So it outlines the various principles that South Africa wants to be part of. So like, for example, the polluter pays principle, the precautionary principle, rehabilitation, defining sustainable development. They all are couched, I think, in Section 2.4 of that act. And it's very important because those principles then filter into other acts, but I'll explain that now. Then you've got your two other main chapters, and the one is how to deal with environmental authorizations, and the other chapter deals with compliance and enforcement of any person who violates the rights. So just to give you an understanding of what do we mean by environmental authorization. So in South Africa, you can't undertake certain activities unless you have been granted an authorization. So, for example, a mining company, they want to mine in a certain area, let's say in the Northwest. They would have to obtain an environmental authorization for them to start that mining process. And they have to undertake various studies, both environmental impact assessments, specialized studies, so maybe the special fauna and flora or wildlife there that needs to be relocated, or socioeconomic rights, social and labor plans, all of that. They do all these studies and then they submit it to the various departments and then they get approvals. And one of those approvals is an environmental authorization. And there's a public participation process that goes with that and all of that. But essentially, that's what we mean by environmental authorization. And there's a massive chapter in that act, that framework, that describes the importance of environmental authorization, what you need to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then the compliance one, so that, where I described your blue, green, and brown scorpions, that's where they get their power from. And you can typically find them either at national or municipal, or sometimes in certain areas, geographical areas. So like the Kruger National Park, like every game ranger, they are deemed a green scorpion with a certain level. But then you get other types of investigators and things like that. And they're called environmental management inspectors. That's their real name, but they're known as the green, blue, and brown scorpions. And like I said, they're the ones that they are in charge of compliance and enforcement in South Africa from an environmental perspective. Okay. Over and above that, the National Environmental Management Act acts as a framework act for many other acts that have. So I keep talking about green, blue, and brown. And again, with our various legislation, our sub-environmental legislation, they tend to categorize them as such. So you've got your National Environmental Management Act, which is the Framework Act. So it sits at the top, just underneath Section 24 of the Constitution. And then you have all these other little acts that are specialized acts to deal with specialized issues in the environment. So the first one, for example, the acronym there is NEMBA, but it's actually the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act. And so what do we mean by biodiversity? Obviously, it's your fauna, your flora, but it goes a little bit further. It also talks about customary law, from indigenous and traditional leaderships in South Africa and things like that. So that all falls underneath there. And then, sorry, the next one shouldn't be NEMBA, it should be NEMPA, which is the National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act. And underneath there, we talk about certain areas that get protection. So, for example, the Cradle of Humankind, or Mapungubwe, or the Kalahari National Park, or Marakeli, all of those areas fall underneath that area, and that is to protect those areas. So when a protection has been implemented, well, that's it. You can't touch it. You can't do mining on it. You can't do anything. It's now got this protection. So just to give you quickly, you've got NEMWA, that's the waste one. You've got NEMAQUA, which is the air quality one. Then you've got NEMINCA, which is the coastal management one. So, obviously we've got like 6,000 kilometers, I think, or 3,000 kilometers of coast that needs to be managed carefully so we can protect those areas. Then you've got your MPRDA, which is your Mineral, Petroleum and Resources Development Act. It only falls underneath the National Environmental Management Act as a framework act insofar as its environmental issues. Then you've got the National Water Act and then the Heritage Act. And all of those have various, obviously, sections and clauses and specific things government must undertake and specific things that communities must take and specific things when development's going to be undertaken and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's in a nutshell. And each of those have their own regulations as well and policies and plans that come with it at the various departmental levels. So like, for example, under the National Water Act, you've got your National Water Strategic Plan, you've got your National Water Strategic Policy, and they all talk to various principles underneath those areas. Okay, let's move on to the next section, which is principles of environmental law. So this, I said, you're going to find it in the National Environmental Management, but the main ones are sustainable development, polluter pays principle, precautionary principle, rehabilitation principle, and there's another one I didn't mention here, access to information principle. So sustainable development, I think we all understand, it's an anthropocentric view of it, and it's actually quite important to take stock of that because, like I said, we're now using it just for the benefit of human and not for the benefit of the environment itself. and this might cause an impact later on. The polluter pays principle, it's self-defined, and it's very clear. So, for example, uh, say, for example, a shopping mall's waste is being polluted in a wetland, and this is an actual case that I had. What happens there? Well, we took them on, we took them to court and said this is unlawful, and the court said, well, yes, you have to stop. You can't throw your chemical and human waste into a wetland. It's obviously going to impact the environment. It's going to impact Section 24 and all of that, and it's going to impact the National Environmental Management Act. So that's where that fell. The precautionary principle is a little bit more tricky because it depends on what's the science available at the time. So sometimes the precautionary principle is problematic because the science is not out yet, and so we have to wait, and it might have a negative impact because we might have to ramp up later. But sometimes it has a very good benefit in that, well, we have to wait to see what sort of science will come out in the next 5 to 10 years, and if that science helps us in dealing with it, then we obviously need to have a precautious view of how to on taking any certain actions that you want to that might harm the environment. The last one is the rehabilitation, or the second last one rather, is the rehabilitation principle, which is linked to sustainable development. So this is actually very, very important in that, and it's a perfect example of why anthropocentric philosophy is failing. So in the Act, it states that if you're a mining company and you have damaged the environment, you must rehabilitate. But you only need to rehabilitate to a certain point in time. You don't need to rehabilitate as if you were never there. And that is highly problematic because what the mining companies will typically do is they'll just slap on a bit of grass on those, big mounds in Mpumalanga, and that for them is called rehabilitation. And that obviously has a massive impact on the ecology in that area. It has a massive impact on the communities in that area because people are breathing in that dust. It has an impact on pollution from an air quality. It also then goes into the water table. Anyway, the issues are endless, but that just shows how that principle is problematic. We should be telling minds to try and fix it as if they were never there. And that obviously, would allow the environment to recuperate, and who knows, maybe then use that environment for agriculture later on or whatever it is. But at the time when the mines decide to leave, obviously you can't touch that area for at least 50 to 60 years, which is highly problematic. Okay. So, okay, and I've discussed what we talk about in terms of the anthropocentric approach of the use of our natural resources. It's not the best. Like I said, it might have been a good approach, maybe 20, 30, even 40 years ago, but now it just is not a sustainable solution. The last principle is access to information, which is really, really important. So, public participation and access to information are fundamental principles that allow the ordinary citizen, public, silver-based organizations, non-profit organizations to actually take on big corporates. Without having access to information, we wouldn't really know what's going on. We wouldn't really know what's happening on the ground. And so then we wouldn't be able to take them on. Without information, we can't go to court. And so the legislation is very strong in South Africa. We're the only country in the world that allows to actually ask private companies to provide us with information. Normally it's always just state-owned organizations or the state itself that you can ask for information, but you can never, in most other countries, you can't ask for private access to information. But in our constitution, we actually say we can get information from private organizations, which is really, really something to be for it to be promoted. I mean, it's a really good clause. Now, how do we go about getting access to information in South Africa? So you've got the Promotion to Access Information Act, and every department has to provide you with information when you undertake an application. And if they don't give you that information, there's typically a reason behind it, and they usually provide you with those reasons, and you can either appeal it or whatever it is. But that is a really important one, particularly with the environment, and the reason why is because there's so much scientific information being spread. So can you imagine if you're trying to oppose a mine and they've got all of these reports that you've never seen before? Well, how are you supposed to, counter their claims? You need to see those reports, read them, study them, maybe find your own expert and see if that expert agrees or not agrees with those reports to try and take on the company. So that's a really important principle. Okay, so that's environmental legislation. Is there anything else from your side in terms of questions before we
Um,
move?
I have one question that
Yeah.
pop up. So, like regarding law and legislation and policies,
Mm,
everything seems good on paper regarding South Africa's constitution and all the things that we have. We seem to be pretty progressive on paper,
hmm.
but where do things get lost in translation between implementing that and where we are now? Because we're not as progressive when we look at the physical reality of things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a perfect question. I mean, not a perfect, that is a great question. And that is something I think most non-profit organizations like the Legal Resources Center are struggling with. And that's why I think while we have such a large civil-based organization, organizations in South Africa, there's just um, government. You see, the problem is that there's not enough of us to tackle every single issue. So, although government, and I'm not saying every government employee, I'm sure there are plenty out there that want to do good,
Yeah,
but there are some people who obviously don't do good, and who work the system so that they can profit without really any accountability.
yeah,
And I mean, just from just take public interest lawyers as myself. There's
yeah,
maybe 100 of us in the country, which is huge. I mean, it's a huge contingency. But I mean, that's a tip of the iceberg in terms of trying to hold government accountable.
yeah,
So, if you get the wrong person in power, you're going to have corruption, and it doesn't matter how good the laws are, they'll always find a way to manipulate the system for their benefit.
mm,
But that being said, I mean, in the last 2 years,
okay,
I've seen that there has been some sort of process to try and curb out that corruption and actually implement. So, like, just to give you an example, with like when I used to do access to information applications,
yeah,
I would typically it would be like a 10 to 11 month turnaround before I got any information. Now I'm getting it on a 2 to 3 month turnaround.
wow,
So there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, but I mean, we're so far. I don't know if we're going to be able to get it right. But you're completely correct. Our laws are fantastic and our judiciary are really good. When you go to court, they tend to give judgments that are sensible, that promote the Constitution. But
yeah,
then with government, it's one fight after the other. I mean, to give you another example, we've been trying to reopen this refugee office in Cape Town called the Scalabrini RRO. I mean, we've gone to court, we've gone back to court, even though we've won, we've gone back to court, I think 6 times now in the last 2 years to
mm,
try and force the department to actually reopen this refugee site open.
wow,
So, and the court agrees, and the laws are beautiful, and the judgment is fantastic, but the place is not opened yet. People are suffering. Do you know what I mean? So it's a great question. I agree with you. There's definitely a break from the laws that we have versus implementation, and I think government is trying to focus now on implementing, but we'll have to wait and see what the future holds.
So I have one more question. Basically where I stay, I remember my father told me that before they could build in that area, obviously they had to do environmental impact assessments and stuff to see if it's feasible to build in that particular area, well, the complex that I stay in.
Hmm.
And they've been like rejected time and again to not start residential development there. But eventually, I don't know what structure upholds, what institution upholds whether places could be built there or not. But eventually they caved in and they said, okay, yeah, you can build in this area. And okay, personally, I do see the ecological impact. Like, I think I've stayed there since 2006, and there's been a progressive decline in animal populations, amphibian populations. I remember there used to be so many bullfrogs. Now I hear nothing during the seasons they were supposed to be there. And just other things that I happened to notice, and also like the water system there, the like little lake is not as functional anymore because of like I see the consequences and I can see why they rejected development in that area. But what convinces them what convinces them to cave in? Like, is that an example of
Sorry, you just broke up on the last sentence there.
I was just asking, what makes the institutions that implements impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, what makes them change their mind regarding the construction in particular areas? Because I do also witness that um, the eventual like agreeing like to for that place to be developed on, even though the impact assessment would say you shouldn't be developing in this area, it's a vulnerable area because of this and this and that.
Yeah, I mean, another great question. So typically how it works is when you issue your impact assessment for approval,
Yeah.
if government doesn't approve it, they tend to say, okay, well, you need to do a further study or you need to protect certain areas. Um, or you need to go and rethink your plans. And typically, then when they go and redo that and they resubmit, then they get approval because now they've acceded to what government has requested. That in itself is a problem. I mean, government doesn't. I mean, I honestly in the last 5 years of fighting environmental impact assessments, environmental authorizations, I've
Yeah.
only ever seen government reject one outright,
Oh,
and people were not allowed to build. But 99% of the time, it'll be approved. There'll just be certain conditions that will be applied. We have to do another study or whatever. So, like for example, the nuclear power station that they want to build, that was
yeah.
rejected because they said no, you need to do further studies. So they went to go do further studies, and they were going to approve it, but the LRC, with a lot of many other organizations, stepped in and fought to prevent it from being approved.
Mm,
And then luckily, legally we were able to stop it. But I see now it's coming back up for discussion. And so this
mm,
just, it's like I said, government hardly ever says no to an application. They'll just tweak it, give further conditions, new studies or new plans or whatever it is. And once
yeah.
that's been done, then they can go ahead with it. And that's the problem about sustainable development because it's not really sustainable. It's you see them applying the anthropocentric national development plan ideals to try and promote development in South Africa, but at the cost of the environment. Now, I'm not saying that we
See.
must be against development and people need houses, but
Yeah.
when you develop and now you've impacted the bullfrogs, you've impacted
Yeah.
a water resource like a lake, then there should be something to mitigate that. You need to provide maybe an artificial lake in your development plans. You need to make sure that the bullfrogs get relocated or something like that.
Okay. Thank you for answering that question.
Yeah, it's sad though, unfortunately.
It's tricky. I think my sister works under sustainable infrastructure and development, and I see their projects and I'm like, what's sustainable about that?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, there's nothing sustainable. You see, literally, like I said, maybe like 40 years ago,
Yeah.
it would have been sustainable because there would be there'd be such a huge level of bullfrogs in South Africa that it wouldn't matter if, a couple got relocated, that's okay.
Yeah.
But now we're talking, where we've lost like 60% of our biodiversity in South Africa. Now, if we
Yeah.
lose the bullfrogs, what's the impact? Is it going to impact the water system or, is it going to impact because if there's not enough bullfrogs, there's not enough food, then the fish might be impacted. Now, if the fish die, well, then we don't have food for people. Do you know what I mean? There's like this
Yeah.
ongoing cycle that people don't think about their quick wins when they try and deal with sustainable development.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to be a breaker on Tuesday. You got to stay positive though.
It's true. It's true.
So, okay, so I've taken you guys over the environmental legislation. So now let's talk about climate change, environmental justice, where we are in South Africa right now, what's currently happening. What do we mean by all of these various ideas? And then the last one, climate change versus the oil and gas bill. The climate change bill versus the oil and gas bill. Okay. So climate change in South Africa doesn't have its own special constitutional clause. That doesn't exist. It falls under Section 24, but it could potentially fall under other sections like right to dignity, right to equality, access to food, access to water. There are a couple of other rights where, children's rights, all of that would fall under climate change because obviously climate change might have an impact on all of that. It might impact your dignity because if you can't have food or water, if you can't have shelter, if you can't have a property, if you can't access food, well, your dignity is going to be severely impaired. And what's going to potentially happen is that because we know we're in one of the most unequal societies in the world, South Africa, it's just that's going to be even worse moving forward with climate change. It's just going to get because typically the middle class and people who earn an income will be able to afford access to food and water. Although it'll be difficult, they'll still be able to afford it. But people living without an income or income that's like less than like 2,000 rand, well, guess what? You're not going to be able to feed or drink enough water per month for yourself, and that's going to cause serious problems moving forward in South Africa. I mean, currently, right now, we're looking at between 11 to 14 million people starving every day in South Africa, which is crazy considering the amount of food we produce and export overseas. It's just mind-boggling. But that is going to increase, particularly the reason why it's going to increase when we talk about climate change is, and then this is all around access to food, right? We're going to have less areas that are viable or fertile for us to grow food.
Yeah.
And so in 10, 15 years time, people are saying, I think we've got like 15%, don't hold me on the numbers, but I think we've got 15% arable land, and in like 10 to 15 years, that's going to be half from what I understand. So we are looking at a serious food crisis potentially in South Africa, and water as well, because most of our water goes towards the agricultural industry, and we're going to need more water to try and grow more food at a faster, rapid rate on less land. So we're going to have serious water issues as well moving forward. So then kicks in. So you can just see the impact of climate change will have on all the various rights is absolutely crazy. And so this is where the ideas of ecocentric use of our resources. And so there's only one act in South Africa that has taken this into consideration. That's the National Water Act. So what do we mean by ecocentric use of our resources? Well, it's using our resources to not um, destroy the natural resources capacity to provide your basic necessities to people. So what we mean by that is, I'll take the act as an example. So the National Water Act says that we have a reserve, a water reserve. If we go below this water reserve, we are, for lack of a better word, stuffed. Okay. Now, how do we measure that? Well, the National Water Act measures it in two ways: a human reserve and an ecological reserve. That is an ecocentric principle because now we're saying, okay, what do we need to sustain the water from an environmental, ecological perspective, and from how much water do we need for human resources? Now, the one thing that they haven't done correctly under that is elevate to elevate the ecological reserve higher than the human reserve. They are seen on the same level playing field, but at least it's there. And so what's critical about that is that if the ecological reserve doesn't have enough water, well, guess what? Then the humans don't have water. So we need to make sure that we protect the eco environment that where the water flows from in order to make sure there's enough water for human. Now, that principle should be adopted in all the other pieces of legislation and work that we do when moving forward. So, like for example, the development next to your place. What they should have done there was that they should have maybe reduced the footprints where they were going to build, increase your green footprints in and around those areas, and make sure that they are linked to the environment. So instead of wasting 100% of that land on buildings, you're wasting 75% or 50% of that land on buildings, and the rest is then greened around it to make sure that you continuously promote and have this reserve, this ecocentric use of our resources, so that we protect the level of the green biodiversity that exists, that it gets protected, so that we can continue to provide, so that it can continue to provide resources to us. Remember that the biodiversity is, and this is what frustrates me sometimes, that when I talk about bio, I don't talk about rhinos. I mean, yes, they're important, they need to be protected, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a biodiversity environment that can provide survival for humans, right? Which
Yeah.
means we need place for people to grow crops. We need
Yeah.
places where the eagles are allowed to fly, so that they can kill the rodents, so that the rodents don't eat your crops, for example. We need places where water is protected. All of that needs to kick in when we talk about ecocentric. And if we destroy our biodiversity, guess what? Then everything has to become artificial. So we'll have our food growing in warehouses. We have our water being, coming from human waste, from our waste treatment plants. All of that then kicks in, which is
Yeah.
problematic on its own. So that's what we mean by an ecocentric use of our resources. And it's something that environmental justice is trying to promote strongly. And it links very closely to climate change, because
Yeah.
if we start promoting this ecocentric use, we reduce our carbon footprint. Like, for example, creating your own compost heap at home, far better than it being trucked to a land wasteful site, 20 k's down the road, for example, reducing your plastic footprint, using a glass bottle, rather than buying bottled water, that type of stuff. That's the environmental justice initiatives that we're trying to, or not me, but that's what environmentalists are trying to achieve when we talk about the environmental justice. And it links in with the just transition. So the just transition is a process where we're trying to remove the bad elements of capitalism and promote more social reform, but done in a green way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, communism is not a bad principle, but it comes at a significant expense when we talk about industrialization, because we know with the Russian Revolutionary and all of that, that the best way to have promoted communism was to industrialize very quickly, which is something that can't happen now. So when we talk about social reforms and things like that, when we talk about the just transition, all of those principles kick in to make sure that the just energy transition doesn't include coal, for example, doesn't include CO2, doesn't include high emissions. Okay, so those are the underlying concepts that exist around environmental justice, how we're trying to mitigate climate change. And now in South Africa, what we have is we don't have a law that exists that deals with climate change directly.
Okay.
We've got white papers that have been tabled at Parliament, which are actually quite profound and very well thought of. And if you have time to read it, you just type white paper climate change South Africa Parliament. I think it was like 2011's document. Anyway, you can have a look. It's very, very interesting read. And that sort of has set the ground for us to try and deal with climate change in South Africa. And now there's a climate change bill that's before Parliament.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, that bill itself is not really great. It's just another tick exercise, ticking exercise to try and appease the developers and the economy. But at least there is some sort of traction to deal with climate change in South Africa, from a legal perspective. From a policy perspective, so South Africa is linked to the Paris Agreement. We're linked to the IPCC. We've got the President's Panel on Climate Change, and we've got the National Disaster Act, which also speaks to climate change events, climatic events as well. So you can see that governments try to deal with it from an emergency perspective when it comes to that act, but the policies that are trying to move forward. I mean, government is trying to make a difference. It's just that government is in a very difficult position to try and promote the economy in the way that it's doing, which is, the National Development Plan, which is carbon industrialization and all of that intensive. And then on the other side, they're trying to enforce climate change. It becomes very difficult. I mean, Sasol and Eskom are a perfect example. They are our two biggest polluters. And we've been trying to change the laws and the regulations so that they can mitigate and minimize their CO2 emissions. But Eskom and Sasol go to government and says, if we do that, we're out of business, you know? So it's a very difficult position that government's in, but they put themselves in that position because they didn't do anything, and we told them 10 years ago to start doing something, and they still haven't done anything. So that's on them for dealing with that. Another very important issue around it is for example, in the Eastern Cape, it's a drought. It's been a drought for the past 7 years there. Access to water there is going to be absolutely critical. And so what you're going to have is all these other laws like your National Water Act, your National Environmental Management Act, your Biodiversity, your Protected Areas Act, your Waste Act, all of that are, although not directly dealing with climate change, are going to have to deal with climate change when it comes to how their resources being impacted. So like biodiversity, obviously we know it's dealing with the flora and fauna in South Africa that's being destroyed. um, how do you deal with that from a climate change perspective, because there's no legislation that really deals with it. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see how government's going to manage that. And I suppose the non-profit organizations like the Legal Resources Center for Environmental Rights, all of them, they're going to have to step in and actually guide government, because I don't think government has any idea how to manage that. Okay, the next point is COP26. So is it important this year? Yes, it is. Every year, they meet to try and deal with the standards. They're trying to bring it back down. It's also the first year that the US is back in. So that's going to be incredibly powerful to see how the US and China effectively manage the CO2 levels, because obviously they are like 50% of polluting in the world is because of those two countries. So I'm very interested from my perspective to see how the US is going to manage that. Okay. Then the last one is just to sort of really put a kicker and a spanner in the works, and this is the entire problem with government's idea is right now we've got a climate change bill and we've got an oil and gas bill before government. Guess which one's being promoted? The oil and gas bill. Why? Because there's money behind it. And that just sums it up, right? That just sums up the anthropocentric idea: use the environment, destroy the environment, rehabilitate it to some level so that it could be acceptable in 50 years' time. It's completely the wrong idea of how government's moving forward. And then you've got this climate change bill that's just been sitting there for 2 years and nothing's happening. So, again, it's just an absolute disaster from government side. And on that's all I had to share with you guys from the climate change environmental justice side. The last bit is the climate justice charter and what does it mean. So as you know, COPAC has been promoting the Climate Justice Charter for about a year now. They're going back to Parliament to stand up and say, Parliament, why are you not adopting it? So just so you know, in the Constitution under Section 234, Parliament can actually adopt charters. And we want Parliament to adopt a climate justice charter of some sort. Now, will it have an impact with Parliament? I don't know. But what it does do is that it sets underlying principles for government to adopt, which is incredibly powerful. So, in that climate justice document, there are alternative principles, the ecocentric principles, the just transition principles. Everything that I spoke about today is in that document. So really do read it. It's an incredibly powerful document. And what's accompanied with that is the science document. And this is what got me scared, really, really scared, is that in the next 10 years, because of where South Africa is positioned, so say, we keep talking about the world is going to increase by 2 to 4 degrees. Whatever happens in the world, South Africa will be double whatever happens, which means that if in France the degrees increase to 4 degrees, in South Africa you're looking at 8 degrees. Now, that is astronomical. I mean, you're looking at temperatures in Johannesburg then between 40 to 45. That's hot. That's very, very, very hot. And it's going to hurt a lot of people, a lot of poor and marginalized people. I mean, a lot of us are lucky to live in normal houses, but if you're living in in informal settlements, I mean, people are going to die. Honestly, that's what's going to happen. That's the reality. So that science document is a wake-up call. I think it's very important for everybody to read. It talks about how we're going to have less water, how we're going to have less food, how the temperature is going to increase, what's going to be the impact. A very, very, very important document to have a look at. So yeah, so but now the Climate Justice Charter is essentially an aspirational document that we want government to hold themselves to account. So they talk about everything from food to water to climate to reforming the economy to all of that. Very, very powerful document. Like I said, I would really suggest that you guys do go and read it. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Vish or myself will take time to explain to you guys. But yeah, that's in a nutshell what we talk about when we speak about the Climate Justice Charter.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's all she wrote. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for this presentation. Yeah, I have a few more questions.
Yeah,
Based
yeah, of course,
on the
absolutely.
last few slides. How do you think Parliament will respond to the Climate Justice Charter after we've endorsed it, given it to them? What do you think how they're gonna respond?
Well, we've given it to them already
Yeah.
last year, and they didn't respond. So I've sent 3 letters in the last couple of weeks to Parliament asking them, are they going to adopt it or not, and what's the processes for that. So we'll see what happens with that. If they don't, then we would most likely go to court.
Oh, I see. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
And as citizens of this country, what kind of pushback must we facilitate for the government to acknowledge the importance of addressing climate change impact?
That is a very good question. So no, it's a very, very important question.
Yeah.
Um, I think mass action is far more important than a court case. And one thing I have noticed in South Africa and in other countries as well is protest is a very effective way of dealing with it.
Yeah.
Um, you know, if South Africa could rally and get millions of people behind the issues of climate change, I think government would most likely stand up and take stock and would start doing something about it. So
Yeah.
from that perspective, protest action absolutely important. Just make sure that rules and guidelines. The Future for Fridays campaign with Greta is also a very powerful statement to be made. I know there's an organization in South Africa called X with the letter X Extinction.
Yeah.
We are trying to implement that Fridays for Future Change in South Africa, where children don't go to school on Fridays.
Ooh.
That I mean that to be honest, and I know Greta comes from Europe and all of that, and obviously that has its own problems because a lot of African and South American people were doing programs like that, but they didn't get the spotlight or
Yeah.
limelight like she did. But she's done more for green than what Greenpeace or Earth Life has done in the last 10 years. I mean, she has put climate change on on a spot on a pedestal, sorry, and has gotten the youth involved across the world as well. So
Yeah.
it is very important that that work continues. But like I said, obviously it does come with its own problems.
Yeah.
Because she came from obviously from Europe, and therefore for some reason she's now allowed more limelight than somebody from Asia or Africa or South America. But
Yeah.
so, and I mean, a lot of people were upset about that, but we also have to take stock that I mean she did incredible work so far in terms of getting government to turn around and look at it, and the youth as well. I mean, the youth involvement around climate change has exponentially grown since she started her campaigns as well. So there's a positive and negative on both sides. So that's another area that could be looked at. And then finally, from an individual perspective, I think research, writing, and engaging with government is critical.
Yeah.
Um, if the youth um, sorry, I'm also part of the youth. I keep saying the youth, but I'm also part of the youth. If we could, really take on government with letters and submissions, and doing research and telling them where government is failing and doing
Yeah,
master's degrees and saying this is where you're failing, you're going to destroy, and making that public and putting it out on every news media,
yeah,
social media, all of that. I
yeah.
think government again then would start taking stock. And then lastly, the last action, which is powerful, but it's not the only solution, is litigation. That always has strong impact as well.
Okay, okay. I feel like the point you made about Greenpeace is very important because I'm a volunteer for Greenpeace Africa, and the schedules and programmings and what's expected of us is not as radical as I would like it to be. I don't know if radical is the right word, robust. I think that's a better word.
Hmm.
It's like a lot of limitations. There's a lot of like we have to listen to the headquarters, like the main organization, and they reject a lot of like ideas and ways we could go about things. And a lot of their arguments would just be rooted in, oh, there's COVID, you can't do picketing, you can't do this, you can't do that. The most we can do is just post on Facebook. So yeah, there is a little bit of frustration on my side regarding how they go about things on that in that area, and I can see how from the outside it looks like they don't do much. The internal structures are very limiting, and there's a lot of constraints. And the Greta point was also, yeah, that was very important to mention. I heard there was a lot of complaints about that. It's not even particularly her fault. It's more so like the media and where they choose to like place focus. I remember there was like a climate change conference, I think a year or two ago, and they were taking pictures of all the climate justice activists that came from all over the world. And one of them was Vanessa Nakate. And
Hmm.
like so they took a group photo, right? And the BBC photographer took a photo, and then when he published the photo in a particular article talking about the conference, he cropped her out. he cropped
Yeah, no, I remember that. That was an absolute scandal. And yeah, you're right. It's not Greta's fault, and I'm not blaming her at all.
Mm.
And she has done amazing work. I don't think anybody can take that away from her. But you're right.
It's really the media.
It's the media companies that are failing. Because there's this mentality that you're from Europe, you deserve more limelight, and it pisses me off. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's very true because there are indigenous communities all over the world, native communities all over the world that have been advocating for the environment, and now when we have a pause. And the other question that I have is that, you mentioned that, there's a rise of like climate activists, especially coming from the youth. And I've witnessed that myself in South Africa, especially over like the span of since COVID. I think since last year, beginning of last year, I started seeing like a definite rise, even on social media. Like suddenly there's way more environmental, accounts and stuff like that. So where do you, and obviously there's some of these people that I've met are so dedicated to the cause that they would, dedicate their careers towards these these parts, for climate justice. So
Hmm.
where do you think is like, what careers do you think is the most feasible, has the most potential, has the most impact regarding really getting things done in our country. So, like for example, you do environmental law, so that has its own, benefits and impacts. Yeah.
Sure. You've got so many good questions. um,
It's really
that
curious because I'm interested in that. I think I'm currently interested in going into environmental policy and that, like being an environmental policy analyst.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would like to know, are these avenues feasible? Will it make a change? Will it make a difference?
So I just want to address the first thing you said about there's so many more activists.
Yeah.
Um, I think maybe it's time for the youth to actually organize their own climate change youth organization of some sort.
Yeah.
And if you guys are interested, let me know because I set up these organizations all the time. But I
Yeah.
think that would have significant, or doesn't have to be an organization, it could just be a movement.
Yeah.
South African youth activist movement for climate change. I think government are so behind the trends, they're like lost, they're like freaking headless chickens. You don't know what's going on. And I
Yeah.
think, it's going to come from the youth because The old guys are they're over it. They're like, I mean, even when I speak to my family and stuff, it's like, yeah, this, that, and whatever. I'm like, but guys, and it's us because we're going to live there for the next 50 years. We're going to be the ones who are going to struggle. So there's only
Yeah.
one way, is that we have to create movements and start fighting against government, whether it's an advocacy program, whether it's from a policy perspective, legal perspective, whatever it is.
Okay.
Then the second question, in Korea, I think it's threefold. So I think it's science, policy, and law. Because
Okay. I'm interested in all of these.
yeah, no, definitely. Because I mean, the policy stuff is critical, and a lot of we probably are lacking. We probably are lacking policy guys around South Africa. I don't think we have enough talent in that area. The
Yeah.
legal side as well. You've got a lot of lawyers who are working for the banks and the big corporation stuff, but you don't have enough activist lawyers. And then from a science stuff, I mean, without the science, how are we supposed to draft policy and take up legal challenges? I mean, the science is critical. So I'd
Yeah.
say all three of those sections. And then the last one, it's not really a career, but it's the ideals of activism that need to be incorporated into those three areas.
Yeah.
Quite often, people, become a policy analyst, become a lawyer, or become a science, and then they join a large corporation, and then they live their life. They don't have that activist mindset.
Yeah.
So I would always say that together, that activist mindset needs to be there at all times.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
that. I have one more question.
All right.
So as an environmental lawyer and knowing all that you know from your experience, what makes you hopeful about the future?
Um, so, so the youth is one. I mean, I'm not a socialist, but I'm not a capitalist either. I'm not a communist. Like, I'm just somebody
Same.
who just wants to make sure people have a decent life, right?
Yeah.
And I can see that the youth are hungrier than the previous generation. They
Yeah.
want to make sure that South Africa does come right. I think the previous generation were living on this ideal that everything was going to fix itself after apartheid, and
Yeah.
that was never going to happen.
Yeah.
And now you've got a more realistic youth that are like, well, we can either try and fix it or it's going to destroy itself in totality. And they've got a drive to try and fix it. And I think that's where I get my passion for, and to continue working in the sector. And then the other one is I have two little kids,
Mm.
um, and I can see their future is not going to be very bright if I don't try and do something. And I don't think I could live with myself in 20 years' time when my kid says, well, why didn't you do anything? Now we're living like this, why didn't your generation try and do something? At least I can say, well, I did try, that's my second reason why.
Okay. Well, that's a wrap. That's
That's
all
a wrap.
the
Yeah.
questions I have.
Thanks for taking the time out to listen as well. I mean, if
Uh,
you guys want further or more in-depth understanding,
Yeah.
um, let me know. I'll happily take you guys through, maybe on a topic by topic basis rather than, just a general understanding. But yeah, always happy to meet and speak. And yeah, let me know if you guys need anything else.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for
Sure.
dedicating towards the presentation and everything. I learned a lot,
Great.
especially the first 2 points, the first two topics. Um, so yeah, yeah, enjoy your day.
Awesome. Same to you, and say hi to Nkosazana for me.
Okay, cool.
Take care. Hey.
Okay, cool.
Cheers. Bye.